Hello everyone and welcome to this week's episode of A Slice of History with the Butterfly Princess. This week I'm reading you an interview article that was published by in the March 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine. This interview is with Tom Holland, who is 1 minute. Who is a historian, author, and broadcaster. Now, he's been interviewed by Roberta, who is the editor of BBC History magazine. And he answers he ponders the question as to whether 1 minute again. As to whether Tom Holland considers whether emperors such as Nero and Caligula deserve their diabolical reputations. So here goes. 1 minute. I'm going to get the into it up. Yeah, 1 minute. So here, this is an interview article that has been published in the March 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine, and this is an interview with the historian and author Tom Holland, and it's been carried out by Roberta, who is the editor of the BBC History magazine. So the first question: could you please begin by introducing his best-known work, The Lives of the Caesars? Centrus is probably the answer. Centrus is probably the most famous of all the ancient biographers. He was secretary to the Emperor Hadrian, so was right at the heart of imperial power. He also worked as an archivist and librarian in the imperial palace, and therefore had access to all kinds of historical documents. He drew on these to write in around AD 12 biographies of the rulers who would come to be known as the 12 Caesars, the 11 emperors from Augustine to Dalmatian, and before them all Julius Caesar, the adoptive father of Augustus. The lives has had a massive influence on how people understand the Roman Empire. Of all ancient classical texts, this is probably also the most influential of modern culture. It inspired Robert Graves, who would later translate the lives of the Penguin classics to write I, Claudius, 1934, and Claudius the God, 1935. Which were then adapted into the celebrated 1976 BBC drama starring Derek Jacobi. And the series inspired all kinds of US dramas ranging from Dynasty in the 1980s to Soprano in the 90s and 90s, and Game of Thrones in the 2010s. You could say that he's the godfather of the murderous dynastic drama. Question: as a historian yourself, do you consider that it was doing something similar to what you do today? Answer: it's important to say that Stimulus wasn't actually an historian. He was a biographer. He was not aiming to do what Tacitus, his great contemporary, was doing, creating a record of the whole sweep of the Roman history. But of course, because the emperors are so important to our understanding of how the Roman world operated, His work does offer a sense of the Roman Empire in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. That was a period of conversive change. The Republic collapsed, Augustus established an autocracy, and then there was a process of evolution over this 1st century AD. After Augustus died in AD 14, Rome was ruled by his family, the emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, after which the family went extinct. There was then a murderous bout of civil war in AD 69, notorious as the year of the 4 emperors. Vespasian, whose lives were among the 12 related back. Vespasian, who established his own dynasty, was succeeded by his eldest son Titus, who was then followed by his younger brother Demeter. The lives of these emperors are covered by the sister, this biographer as well. Question: what approach did the biographer take in writing these biographies? His range seems to have been very extensive. From surviving fragments of his other works, we get a sense that he was interested in what today we might call social anthropology, customs, habits, the things that people do. Aside from these biographies of Caesar, he wrote collections of the lives of the great courtiers, and sex is also an themes that runs throughout the lives of the Caesars. But he also wrote about children's games and about the insults that people gave one another. He wrote about clothing and about all kinds of aspects of social life, and these in turn informed his portraits of the emperors. He wrote about what they did as children, their appearance, their sexual habits. For this ancient biographer, this provided windows into their characters and the way that their regions were shaped. It enabled him to situate the emperors more clearly in the social, political, and cultural context of the world that they ruled. Next question: why and how did you go about translating the lives of the Caesars? Answer: I was asked to do it because it was felt that the translation done by Robert Graves many decades ago was a bit old-fashioned. There are certain problems, I think, with his work. One strange choice he made was that instead of using Roman military terms such as centurion or tribune, he gave character titles such as sergeant major or colonel or whatever. That is perhaps unsurprising because Graves fought in the First World War, but it gives his text a slightly post-war 1930s flavour. I'm sure that in maybe 60 to 70 years, my translation will seem very 2020s, but I hope that I've been truer to the Latin text than Graves was. One other significant perk of this ancient biographies I noticed was that when writing about an individual empire, he almost never mentioned them by name. It is always he did this, he did that. The biographer might introduce, say, Augustus by name at the beginning of that life, but from that point on it is assumed that any third person verb will be referring to Augustus, and the effect is very powerful. By not drawing attention to the emperor's name, it becomes kind of omnipresent. This emperor is so significant that you don't even need to name him. Everything is revolving around him. I hope that even in English, the reader will find this effect striking. Next question: did you have to make any difficult decisions when translating the text? Purely in terms of how to render Latin and Greek, because there's quite a lot of Greek in the lives too. the huge problem is always Pune's meaningfully translating the ancient biographies. Linguistical Pumes is always a challenge. One of them resolves around oral sex, and that touches on another slightly more moral problem, that there are passages within the ancient biographies text that are shocking, and these passages have always been shocking. There's a tradition that in the 15th century, a Frenchman fighting the English during the Hundred Years' War was seduced into becoming a child killer by reading the ancient biographer's works. The Marcus virtually owned a copy. Then in the Victorian period, school copies featured large chunks that were just replaced with asterisks. Even though today in the 21st century we might pride ourselves on being more perceptive and less easily shocked, the fact remains that there are repellent passages that the question of what to do with them was a moral consideration. But in the end, I decided that I wanted to give an accurate and complete rendering of the languages, so I could as I could. Right. Sorry. Next question. And at that point, the lives feature some truly remarkable stories about some of the emperor's debut behaviour. How seriously can we take these? Answer. I would like to focus on two of these emperors because in some ways their reputation for diplomacy reflects very different Roman cultural traditions. The first of these was Tiberius. Near the end of his life, when he was about 70, he retired to the island of Capri. The ancient biographer gives us completely shocking details of what Tiberius is supposed to have got up to. Their child sex, brothels, all kind of things. Tiberius was then succeeded by Caligula, perhaps the most notorious of all the Caesars. Rather than retiring to a private island, Caligula staged his sexual depravities on the most public of stages, according to the ancient biographer of this work. The temptation to take these accounts absolutely at face value to assume that Tiberius was a hideous pervert and that Caligula was such a sexual terrorist that he was in fact insane. But I think there are different layers in how you can respond to these stories. One of these is to recognise that the Roman understanding of what was shocking and scandalous about sexual behaviour is not the same as ours. Let's think about Tiberius. He was the emperor, and an emperor should not retire. The only conceivable reason, in a Roman's opinion, for doing that was because the person doing it was an absolute pervert. So you can see why Tiberius's reputation was framed by people's hostility to him is reflecting his desire to do disgusting things that he couldn't do while he was in Rome leading a public life. The fact that Tiberius was a very old man and that statesmen who had attained a certain age were entitled to a dignified retirement was ignored. Because Tiberius was emperor and shouldn't have done that. As for Caligula, he was taken to the public stage. He was taken to the public stage and rubbing the noses of his enemies in the Senate, in the fact of their impotence. Both Augustus and Tiberius had shown the Senate respect, but had a different strategy. He wanted to demonstrate that he was the master and that the senators were a bunch of lip spittle nobodies. I think I think that the sexual abuse to which he submitted senators and notably their wives was a way of making that point. That was very brutal and shocking, and why Caligula became such a notorious figure, but there was perhaps an element of strategic thinking that the ancient philosopher didn't acknowledge. Caligula clearly wasn't a liberal, he wasn't Julian Justin Trudeau, but there was probably a method behind the seeming madness. This is part of the fascination of studying the lives of these emperors. There's the shock appeal of the stories, and there's the fascination of working out exactly how and why Roman attitudes to sexuality was different. Was different from ours. And then there's the possible political context that was unspoken and unacknowledged by the ancient biographer, by which men nevertheless explain what is going on, but which might nevertheless explain what is going on. Next question. Was something similar happening with Nero, who was another really notorious figure at the time? Did he get an unfairly bad press from the ancient biographer? Answer. No, because Nero brought it upon himself, and as with Caligula, I think it was a deliberate political strategy. There were really two traditions in Roman politics that the emperors inherited from the age of the Republic. There was the traditionalist approach, showing respect for the traditions of the state and traditional elites, and then there were popular leaders who looked over the heads of them to appeal to the masses of the people. Augustus, Tiberius, and Claudius were all essentially traditionalists in their approach, whereas Caligula and Nero were both populars. They scanned the Senate and wanted to make themselves the darlings of the people. But because they were emperors, they had opportunities to do that in ways that in the Republic, not even the most flamboyant nobleman would have had. And I think that is what Nero was doing. He was clearly the most tremendous showman in a way that was calculated to be shocking to his senators. Emperors were not meant to trade the vote on stage. They were meant to play musical instruments. They were not meant to compete in the Olympics. But Nero did it all, and he did it sufficiently well that people quite admired it. It's as though a US president was starring in an Oscar-winning film, headline Glastonbury, or win a race in Formula One. But Nero did, and even with the most shocking crime of his reign, the murder of his own mother, Nero was pointedly didn't try to disguise it. Instead, he drew attention to it. And I think that's because murdering your mother was the kind of thing that a hero would do in a Greek tragedy. Nero was casting himself as literally being Augustus, somewhere one midway between heaven and earth. He was essentially presenting himself to the Roman people and the world beyond as a figure from myth, as a throwback to the ancient days of someone like the notorious Kratos. The policy undoubtedly caused collateral damage and explains why Nero's reputation was so bad in the wake of his death. And the ancient biographer was clearly drawing on these traditions. After all, the ancient biographer was working for an imperial system funded on the ruins of Nero's reputation and career, so there was nothing for him in trying to regain Nero's reputation. Again, I think it's with Caligula and Tiberius that the ancient biographer's portrait of Nero gives the historian enough clues to enable them to work out out what Nero was doing, what he was up to, but you've got to read between the lines. Next question. In your introduction, you suggest that these rulers are both familiar and strange to us at the same time. Could you elaborate on that point? Answer. I think they're familiar to us because the ancient biographies give us details about these individual empires to a degree that we simply do not have far comparable imperial figures from Near Eastern and Mediterranean ancient history. Think of the pharaohs or the kings of Assyria or Babylon or Persia. There was aristocrats ruling empire that were just as sophisticated as the Roman Empire. Compared with the portraits we have of Augustus or Nero, however, they seem anomalous. The whole point of ruling in Egypt or Persia was to amaze the pharaoh of the great king. Thanks to the ancient biographer, though, we know how the emperors had sex, how they went to the toilet, what they looked like, their hairstyles, the hairstyles they wore, their bodily blemishes, and so on. We know the most intimate details about them, and that makes them one seem vivid and alive and familiar to us in a way that is fairly unique. In ancient history, it explains, I think, why imperial Rome tends to fascinate the general public in a way that other civilizations don't. At the same time, I hope you will get a sense that from what I've been saying, that ancient Rome was a very alien civilization. The code of behaviour that governed not just the emperors but also Romans generally were very remote from ours, and it's that strange blend of familiar and the way that I think explains why Rome is so fascinating. There's a kind of science fiction quality to it. If you think of science fiction of being a mixture of what is familiar to us with worlds that are utterly alien, then that is what ancient Rome gives us. So, next question. Of all the weird and wonderful stories within the book, are there any particular are there any that particularly stood out for you? One of the things that becomes answer. One of the things that one of the things that became very evident when you read the biographies in their entirety is that even as the ancient biographer was clearly getting stuck in art into archives. He was skimming the stories in which the supernatural was very vivid. One of the most dramatic and celebrated moments in the ancient biographies, the lives of Julius Caesar's famous crossing of the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary of the area controlled directly by Rome. Caesar sent his legions ahead of him, then travelled in secret through the night from up to the frontier. He stood on the bank, he hesitated, and then the ancient biography tells us a great ghostly figure snatched a trumpet and blew it. This served as the signal to Caesar that he should cross the river. The dice was thrown, the Rubicon was crossed, history changed, and the fact that there is this weird supernatural element and it's introduced exactly, it's describing something completely everyday. It's often written out of the story. For instance, I did not include that in my earlier accounts of the crossing of the Rubicon, but looking back at it now, perhaps I should have done. Throughout all these stories, there is a sense that what was happening was being governed by fate, that the gods were always watching down, and that it was possible for mortals who could read these signs correctly to initiate what was going to happen. This is really important part of the universe that the ancient biographer has bequeathed us, created us. Last question. If through some miracle of technology you could interview one of the 12 Caesars on your podcast, The Rest is History, who would you choose? Answer: Julius Caesar, simply because his contribution of his combination of an extraordinary life and piercing ruthless intelligence would make him the most interesting guest to interview. I think, though, for my own selfish purposes, for wanting to understand how the Roman world ticked and how the course of Roman history was changed, I would choose Augustus. He was probably the most remarkable political operator, not just in Rome, but in the whole of Western history, maybe even world history. And that concludes this week's edition of a slice of history with the Butterfly Princess. This, as I said, has been published in the March 2025 edition of the BBC History magazine. And the interviewer for this interview article was Tom Holland, a historian and author and a co-host of the Rest is History podcast. And he was interviewed by Rob Attar, the editor of the BBC History magazine. Thank you for tuning in this week, and I really appreciate your time for tuning in and listening to these episodes, whether you watch them on the Butterfly Princess Show YouTube channel or you choose to watch them through the Butterfly Princess Show Facebook page, or you decide to interact with the Butterfly Princess through the images of her on the Butterfly Princess Show Instagram account. I really appreciate your support and would always welcome new viewers. If you're new to the Butterfly Princess Show, then please come and join me. You can follow me on YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. Just type in the Butterfly Princess Show on any of them platforms and my pages will come up, and you just click like and follow, and then you can keep up on skate with all my shows, with all my educational episodes that I do. So thank you for tuning in. I will see you very soon. Bye bye for now. Take care.